So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Igiaba Scego. And we'll have the Portuguese Member of Parliament, Marisa Matias, that will talk about migration.
Lo dico per gli interpreti.
Thank you, Igiaba. I'll speak Italian with Igiaba and English with Marisa. So thank you, and I'd like to thank the interpreters that help us understand each other.
That's in everyone's minds. Only a few days ago, the European Union has signed an agreement with Turkey that many have defined an inhuman as well as an ineffective agreement. And from your privileged seat of the European Parliament, I would like to ask you your opinion of it.
Hello again. If I would have a privileged seat in the European Parliament, that agreement would never exist. Okay, I think it's not only inhuman, it's shameful. It's exactly the opposite that we have to do concerning what is happening with the refugee, with the humanitarian crisis, and with the migrants who try to reach Europe. And I think it's even worse, there's a perverse sense in this agreement because we are creating in Turkey a kind of Guantanamo type 2. We are just trying to move back to Turkey those who are trying to get away from Turkey, and to a country which not only has proved over the last years to play a double standards game, but also which doesn't even, as a guarantee of protect the human rights in the most basic sense of it. We are not talking about a country which has, for instance, signed the Declaration or the Convention of Geneva. We are not talking about a country which has assumed any kind of responsibility in terms of refugees. In fact, ironically, the only kind of refugees that Turkey is obliged to accomplish with having some kind of protection to human rights are the European refugees. So everything is wrong. I don't know where to start. I don't know where to finish.
But what do you think we should do? What do you think is an alternative response to the one that the European Council has given?
I think that we are just making a huge crisis of something which could be solved in a much simpler way. First of all, first answer, safe passage. It's not the end of the world. It's the only answer that we can give in a situation like that. Safe passage. If people say that we cannot have the conditions for having 1 million refugees in 28 member states, they must be kidding. And I'm talking about the emergency response, because if we look, for instance, to Lebanon, a population of 4 million people, they have 2 million refugees there, 50% of the population. If we look to Jordan, 30% of the population. So European Union and European institutions also have opted for a kind of outsourcing service and trying to put the problems in the borders of the conflicts. We are not dealing with this for the first time. This problem has already decades. So we saw it with the countries from North Africa. We now see it in the countries of Middle East. And now we see it with this agreement to Turkey. So for an emergency response, I would say safe passage and guarantee the conditions to receive the refugees who are searching Europe for asylum. That would be the emergency response. But of course, there are a lot of others. And I've been fighting a lot in the European Parliament in order to pass an embargo to selling weapons to the areas in conflict, because we know very well that a lot of European countries have huge amount of businesses with countries which then pass the weapons to the terrorist groups, and also an embargo to buying oil from the occupied territories by the terrorist groups. But even saying this, we are already talking just of a small part of the world, and there are a lot of other countries in Africa also needing our solidarity. And we have responsibilities. I'm not going to tell the entire story, but we have responsibilities in these conflicts. And I think that emergency answer would be safe passage and to create finally an asylum seeker condition at European level, because we don't have it. And as a more grounded answer to start to deal with the problems at the origin, and of course is not only in Syria or in Iraq that we are having problems, but I think we should think a lot when we see that even Iraq receives more refugees than the European Union as a whole. That means a lot about our behavior and the way we are not dealing with this. But there are so many things that we can do that I could spend hours
and we'll get back to this at with the last question. Safe passage, passo all'italiano, corridoi umanitari.
Humanitarian corridors. Italy has proven in these last few months that this is a possibility which is feasible. This was a pilot project started by the community of Sant'Egidio for Syrian refugees in the Lebanese camps. It's one of the few good examples of non-governmental activism which should be followed by those who have the privilege of ruling a country. Igiaba, could you help us taking a sort of a broader approach than what is covered in the media? When we talk about migration, we talk about the Balkan route, the war in Syria, but migration is a far more broader phenomenon that goes beyond the wars which are at the borders of Europe. So based on your own experience, could you share with us what it means to migrate over and above the humanitarian emergency? Good evening, everyone. I think we should sort of have a more sort of broad-based public narrative about migration. So we should start thinking about free movement of people, free movement, people that can travel freely. Because I think we're living in an apartheid-like climate. You have people that are allowed to travel. You go on the web, you purchase a low-cost flight, and you can off you go. And then there are people who can't travel. I'm Somali origin. I keep telling that my parents came to Italy by plane. My brother studied in Prague, and he was traveling from Prague to Mogadishu. In the 70s, in the 80s, there was such a possibility of traveling around. Today, from Somalia, from Eritrea, from Western Africa and Syria, you can't come to Europe legally, so you're forced to migrate. This is something you've got to understand, or else you don't understand why people take these rickety ships. I've been to Hargeisa in Somaliland, in northern area of Somalia, for a book fair, because you have book fairs which are organized in Africa as well, even though you are not aware of it. I spoke with many young people who told me, I want to go into Tarib, which is a journey towards the Mediterranean. But migrations are not simply dictated by the fact that you want to sort of flee the war. Of course, Syrian refugees are very much in such a situation, and we in Somalia were faced with this situation. But on many occasions, people wish to travel around to act as a tourist. Are we standing in the way of such a possibility? Why do we think that body could be dangerous if that body migrates? Why do we feel that only European people, European youth, can travel around and gain some experience when they travel abroad. So we have to change our standpoint. This is crucial, and Europe could do much more than what it is doing, and it would be cheaper to do that. Paradoxically, the security process, the Frontex, and the various institutions are absolutely nonsense because they're extremely costly. It would be much cheaper to welcome people. It would be good for humanity. It would be less costly if the whole of the inhabitants of Eritrea and Syria would come to us in Europe. So it's a psychological problem. We're living a sort of a schizophrenic experience. Could you carry on this sort of psychological line? Could you share with us a very strong image that you used a few days ago when we met that makes us consider the risk that we get used to the pain of others, the deaths that we see every day in the Mediterranean, in the Balkan route. We've got to bear in mind and remember that we've not always been so inhuman. No, we weren't that way, especially that was true for Italy. I do remember when Jerry Maslow died. Jerry Maslow was a South African student who was killed in Villa Literno. I do recall that the funeral were broadcast live on television in 2005 when 13 Somali people died. There was a funeral which was organized at the Capitol Square, which is the square of town hall, and the whole of the Somali diaspora was there. There were many Italian personalities. There was Pietro Ingrao and many other people, and that wasn't a very long time ago. So 13 people were too many. Now we're getting used to kids dying, drowning in the Aegean Sea. We're getting used to tragic choice. And the one thing which sort of scares me is that at some point we'd have to choose between the European Union and human rights. We have to choose human rights in the European Union. That is crucial. And let me add one more point. On the question of the journey, which I mentioned, I wanted to mention here something which was mentioned by Khalil Metref, a Moroccan journalist living in Italy. For an African person, it's difficult to travel in Africa. Well, you need a visa to visit 50% of African countries. In many African countries, Egypt, where Junior Regeni was killed, Equatorial Guinea and Sao Tome Prince do not issue a visa. So we have to consider that as well in our discussion. Thank you. I move back to English.
Italian to you as well. I mean, people, okay. Va bene, allora continuiamo in italiano, spero Marisa.
I carry on in Italian, and I hope I will speak Portuguese the next time round we meet. So I would like to pursue this discussion on the psychological issues. People get used to pain and sorrow. That is a fact, but we've also seen an extraordinary response to the pain and the sorrow of other people. I'm talking about the movement, Refugee Welcome. Austrian citizens that went with a motorcade to pick up migrants from Hungary. And that is the sort of Europe that gives us hope, and it makes us stay in Europe with some dignity. So I wanted to ask you, Marisa, how do you view the strength of European citizens to have a greater measure of dignity than the people who are ruling Europe?
Hope we still have, honestly. I'm sorry, I cannot answer in Italian. I could try, but it would take a long time. I think is one the hope we still have is for instance, just to come back for yesterday, which is just a simple image, but when all the leaders were concerned, and especially when I'm talking about Belgium, I'm referring to Belgian leaders were concerned of increasing security measures and blah, 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 all the things we know. People immediately started to do things like offering their houses to receive people. The taxi drivers just simply put the taxis at service of everyone who wanted for free. So there are still some movements of solidarity. But I think that a major problem lies in the fact that we also see the increase of racism and xenophobia movements like we were not used to see some years ago. And these are two parallel ways. It's difficult that they cross, so it's kind of waiting to see what will happen, but I hope that, of course, solidarity will win over racism and xenophobia and all these different movements, which are also starting to gain terrain in Europe. Yeah. And in different countries, of course, not only in specific countries, in different countries. When we looked what is happening, and I agree to what Igiaba was saying, why do we make a distinction between or amongst refugee and economic migrants? Why do we do it? People need to leave their countries, period. But it happens that we do it at some point just in order to be more efficient. And at the end, we are not efficient in any case. But it's true that I think we should not make this distinction, although we need it for different purposes, but I think we should not do this distinction. And across Europe, yes, we see these movements, but then they simply, there's a need of a lot of strength. I'm contacted by these group movements, like for instance, Refugees Welcome, all the time, because then they just have to deal with the huge amount of bureaucracy which does not enable them to make their work as they want to do in terms of receiving refugees in this case.
One very quick question to both of you. I'm going to ask you to give a suggestion to Yanis. Yanis has taken the ambitious step of launching a pan-European movement to change public opinion in Europe, as he was clearly explaining at the beginning, to change political processes in Europe. What do you think should be the one or two top priorities of the movement when it comes to the discussion we are having and to the refugee and migration situation?
When it comes to migration, I think we have to put in the table a simple thing. European Union has a lot of agreements with different countries in the world, and with all of them based mainly in economic trade rather than in other things. But we should put as a condition that when it comes to visa or when it comes to travel allowances, there should be reciprocity. We cannot still having these kind of deals with all countries in the world in order that for these countries to get an agreement, an association agreement with us, they need to give up on their own capacity of letting us enter or not, but we put all the restrictions, and I think that's one of the most unfair things that we are dealing with. It's at the level of the European agreements and institutions, and reciprocity would be a very good thing to put in the table and to say we will not accept international cooperation based on this level of inequality and unequal treatment of people. Okay. A second issue has to do with, and is a very brief one, what Igiaba said just before. We need to discuss human rights at the European Union. We simply forget to do it, and is the crucial dimension for this movement or any other movement. We cannot allow that just people or children or women which are suffering, people just, I don't know how to say that, but they close their mouth with, I don't know how to say it in English.
They sue them.
Yes, or we cannot allow to put people in camps which were used for other means in the worst period of our history. We cannot allow to build walls and walls and walls which are much more expensive than to treat well people. And nevertheless, we still have this colonial capacity of putting into discussion human rights in every single seat of the European Parliament, Commission, Council, and there's never ever a debate about human rights in Europe. And every time we try to put it, and I finish with this, like for instance with what is happening in Hungary, or so, we cannot do it because, as we know, human rights are an issue outside Europe and not inside Europe. So starting from inside could be a good suggestion, I would say.
Good job.
I will be very brief. I believe that one point is that of the representation we offer, not only when we speak of refugees, but at all levels, to bear in mind that we, migrants and the daughters and sons of migrants, do exist, and particularly in the course of time, support the local struggles that are carried out. I am here with a member of the G2 generation, of the G2 network in Italy. We still don't have a law on Italian citizenship, and surely we will not have one. The law will not be passed because they consider us as a branch, as a terrorist branch. We are still, the second generation migrants are still not recognized. I do hope that the law will be passed before I die. Yes, we will get the bill approved. I thank both of you. We started saying that DiEM should go beyond the belonging to this political force or the other, and this is really the sort of perspective you have expressed during the course of this conversation. To support safe passage, humanitarian corridors means simply to stay on the right side, to stay on the side of those who put the word dignity at the first place. Thank you very much. And let's hope that we can continue working together, and I am sure we will.